Hey, friends, thanks for being with us. We are continuing through chapter 11, the book of John, kind of getting to the tail end of the narrative part of the Lazarus story. There's a conflict part that happens we probably won't get to today, but let me jump in here, verse 38. Read for several verses here and then come back and have some conversation. Then Jesus, again, greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, already there will be a stench because he's been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. And Jesus looked upward and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." And when he said this, he cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, his face wrapped up in a cloth. And Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." So clearly the culmination of the story, the mountaintop here, Jesus having been moved by the grief around him, Jesus having been moved by the plight of human condition and the pain that accompanies human experience, has wept, and after weeping, he goes to the tomb. And again, this was not unusual. If you remember yesterday's thing, when Mary left, the people with her thought she had gone to the tomb to grieve. So this is the equivalent of Jesus going to the cemetery to see the marker. I mean, this is not surprising to us. Certainly would have been a surprise when he said, "Move the stone." And that, the idea is that that would be a permanent barrier. And so they protest, he's been dead for a while, Jesus. That's not, remember, we are in the pre-formaldehyde era. That would be, there would be a smell. And he says to Martha, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you will see the glory of God?" You know the rest of the story. Jesus has this conversation with God and then does what we've known he was going to do since this story started, calls Lazarus to come out. And I think if there's anything that that I notice about this text, Michael, it's that, interestingly enough, and we get a little bit of this in the follow-up. On Monday, we will get a little. But what is striking, I think, about this telling is that there's no record of any. John doesn't need to tell us how people reacted. That he just leaves it there. Even so subtle as to say the dead man came out. This is not, I think, in John's mind, a moment that needs very much commentary.
Yeah, so that's a stylistic thing that we've seen previous. John's not really interested in a lot of subtle characterization and storytelling as it relates to these subsidiary characters in the story, because ultimately Jesus is the central character of the story, and all of the encounters with Jesus are lenses that sort of refract light in such a way that you can see another element of who Jesus is. But I do think it's really important as we look to this text, Clint, to just recognize John begins with another reference to Jesus's heart. He's been moved. In this case, it says greatly disturbed in our translation. So Jesus is clearly, in this moment, affected by what has happened to Lazarus. And then when he comes and he makes this claim, it's really it's both a spiritual kind of call, take away the stone, take away the thing that's imprisoning this body. And I think in a really substantial way, Clint, it's also a very practical sort of where rubber meets the road kind of faith command. It's to say, if you believe, this is going to require you doing something. And the action here as you've already said, it is something that no one there would have expected. It would have been offensive both to the senses, but also to the sensibilities, this kind of action. Because this man now, by all accounts, is dead. 4 days in, we've said this before in previous conversations, 4 days in, this man's body is dead and his soul is gone. In that original culture, this time is enough to allow for that window. So all that's left now is to comfort those who are grieved. And when Jesus comes, even though he is himself greatly disturbed, he's going to reveal something about himself, but he brings others along with him in that effort when he gives that call to take away the stone. And the question that hangs over the characters of this story is, will they do that? Will they listen to Jesus? Will they allow for this miracle to happen? Or will they keep him boxed in? And John doesn't spend a lot of time narrating that, but I don't think John needs to, Clint. I think it's sort of built into the way that John tells this entire gospel, that Jesus and the encounters that all of these people have with him creates moments of opportunity. And the disciples who believe, who see Jesus for who he is, they consistently take that opportunity. They take Jesus at his word. They do what he asks. And in this very practical moment, Jesus, after some pushback about, you do know the state of the reality, right, Jesus? Ultimately, they're going to do that. They're going to do what Jesus asks. And the story is in many ways is showing us, though John's not going to narrate exactly how the stone moves, right? The story is told in such a way that it allows these characters to have a moment to take Jesus at his word.
Right, and all of us who know where this gospel story is ultimately going, you shouldn't be able to get past verse 38. There's a dead man, a tomb, a stone. I mean, this is all planting the seeds for later story. John, we've said this before, John is not interested in the idea of saving up for later. John's not worried about stealing the thunder of the resurrection story. So what is this? This is a precursor, a forerunner of Jesus' own story. Life in the midst of death, living in the face of the grave. And it is significant that at that moment, before Jesus makes that call to Lazarus, he prays. He acknowledges, Father, I thank you, and I've said this for the sake of the crowd. Again, no doubt, no question. I've said it so that those who hear may believe that you sent me. So what is this ultimately? It's a sign. It's a sign of who Jesus is. It's a sign of Jesus' power. It's a sign of God's power and the role that Jesus plays in bringing that. And this command, Lazarus, come out. And you and I have been to and performed lots of funerals. Michael, I mean, our listeners have been to many funerals. This is a hard story at an emotional level to get in touch with because it's familiar to us, but literally try to imagine that Jesus walks into not even a funeral, a cemetery, and calls someone to life, and that person gets up. I mean, John has been carefully orchestrating this entire narrative to bring us to this moment, to again push back the boundaries on who we think Jesus is and who we understand Jesus to be. What did he hear 3 different times? Lord, if you'd been here, if you'd been here, if you'd been here. And now Jesus says, I don't need to be that. There aren't barriers. I'm not able up to a point. I am the Son of God. I am the I am. And here I think John has just done a really fantastic job of bringing us to the pinnacle of that story. And obviously this is a tough story to resonate with, but we should take a moment to reflect on how unbelievable, incredible, and awesome what happens is.
And I do think it's worth noting there's an exceptional nature to the prayer that Jesus offers here, Clint. Jesus has not said a lot of prayers throughout the miracles here in the Gospel of John. So this idea, thank you for having heard me. I know that you've always heard me, but I said that for the sake of those who are with me here, for the crowd, that they might believe. Clint, there's an interesting note here that in the Gospel of John, Jesus doesn't have doubts. Jesus is not wondering where God is or if God will be faithful. And in fact, I'm not going to drift too far into this, but there's a whole sort of stream of modern scholarship that has sort of reflected upon, well, was Jesus, did he have doubts during his life, and what was his worries and anxieties? And that gospel, like John, is just uninterested in that, in sharing details about an inner dialogue. When Jesus prays, it's a prayer of utmost 100% confidence. God, I know that you're with me. I know that you always hear me. But for the sake of those people gathered here, might they be able to see and believe. That's the 100% confidence of God in flesh, a light that has come into the dark world. And it's at this moment then, after this prayer, Jesus, connected to the Creator God through prayer, he makes this claim, a command, Lazarus, come out. And I should circle back around because I think I maybe said something that is maybe a little obscure or obscured by how I said it. Note that the text never does explicitly say what ultimately is going to be the outcome of that whole command about taking away the stone. I've heard people make a big deal about the fact that when they move the stone, ultimately no one needs to go get Lazarus, and that he's bound, and after 4 days, a stiff body, sort of mummified and entombed. The idea would be that the only way that a body like this could sort of come out would be if essentially the body's like forced up to the front of the tomb. And I think there's a really interesting that's not in the text, but the idea that somehow this body that wouldn't have been capable of moving in those bonds, in those strips of cloth, Jesus actually has to give the second command, move the stone away, and then the second command is to unloose him, unbind him, get him from the prison that's holding him. That surely is not just a physical reality, that's also a spiritual reality, that in Christ we're not only restored to life, but we experience spiritual life in a way that we couldn't have without him.
Yeah, I think you have to be a little careful with this because I'm not sure that this is the meaning of the text, but I think there's a sense in which that's bigger than even that moment. Jesus has been moved. Remember, in the flow of the story, Jesus, from the very get-go, knew what he was going to do. He told the disciples, he's dead. I'm going to make him live, right? We've known this was coming, and yet Jesus has been affected by the crowds. Jesus has been saddened. He's been grieved by the grief of the people. Now, yes, some of that, I'm sure, is because Lazarus is dead in that moment, but I think I join many other scholars in saying, I'm not as a scholar, but I join the idea of the scholars who say Jesus is moved by the reality that there's pain in human life, that human life has suffering in it and death, and he wants more than that for those he loves. And so I think this unbind him and let him go, I think that's an interesting subtext for the work that Jesus does, because you know the parable, right? The strong man, who is Satan in the parable, has to bind people, and the homeowner lets him. So the idea that strong man, Jesus is unbinding people. He wants life, not death. He wants good, not bad. And I've always been struck by how quickly Jesus transitions here, Michael, from, Lazarus, come out, dead man, get up, to, take his wrappings off, because now those are in his way. Those are a sign of death, and he no longer needs them. And that sort of illustration or image of new life and being unbound and taking off grave clothes, I think John would have appreciated all of those metaphors, and I don't think it's an accident that they're in there.
I think that there's an important transition sort of ground that needs to be laid as we prepare to turn to the text that follows this, because Clint, your point about the cemetery, I think, is a really essential point. If you can imagine a person going to a cemetery and saying this thing, and the resurrection moment happening, I think that most of us, at least at the first thought of that encounter, think, I would be astonished, I would be filled with faith, I would want to follow that person. It would be the ultimate kind of confirmation, I think, is what a lot of us would assume. But Clint, this is in many ways a story about restoration, but it's also in the giving of life and the resurrection of it. It's also a story that's somewhat macabre. There's a kind of anti-logic to a story like this, which is unnerving. And I think in our modern Western popular culture, you have entire sort of genres of things that people are interested in, like the idea of the zombie, which is this sort of dark kind of image of someone who's not dead but was dead and is dead, and people are sort of captivated by that image. What's happening here with Lazarus is, by every account, a miraculous revelation of the extent of Jesus's power. But it also, I think you can see in that how it represents a very dangerous overturning of the world and the order and the system that's expected, right? You live and you die, and that's the end of it. And there are some people, in particular in this crowd, who are going to find this reversal that Jesus is demonstrating to be so terrifying, to provoke so much anxiety, to put at risk so much of their own life and their values and their positions, that it's going to become for them a lightning rod moment in their relationship with Jesus. And I don't want to get to the text that we're going to engage with next Monday or the next video in this series. I do want to say, however, that I think what's going to come has a way of coloring where we are. And that is to say that this is both a remarkable and vibrant and life-filled story, and it's also an unsettling story because it undoes something that we all, even to this day in our experience, take for granted. That once there is a body that has no life, that body will not have life again. And yet in the face of Jesus, as John tells the story, that is not the ending. That at Jesus's command, everything changes. And you mentioned it, and you'd said to an early church that was anxiously expecting Jesus, why aren't you back yet? In a story in which Jesus wasn't back yet, but ultimately restores the man who's been dead for 4 days. That's exceedingly good news, because what it means is, even if Jesus doesn't show up on your timeline, he has the power, whatever the amount of power is that's needed, he has the power to make things right. If you but, as we have in the text, if you but believe in him. If they believe that it is God who sent me, Jesus says in verse 42. And I think John has told the story in such a way that we glimpse the power and goodness of Jesus, but we're about to see also how that power is very threatening and is done in such a way that unsettles some of those who are there.
One connection I think that speaks to that, Michael, is that, remember, Martha in that first encounter with Jesus proclaimed him Messiah. She said, You're the one. You're the Messiah. And yet, she believed that death was still a limitation of the work that he could do. Now, in the aftermath, Martha, who was close enough for Jesus to speak to at the tomb, now knows something new about what it means that he is Messiah. The Messiah is not limited by death. Lazarus is, but don't miss that sets the stage for even his own death, which is going to be Jesus' shift in focus here in another, half chapter or so, chapter maybe. And I just think it shouldn't be missed that Jesus is standing there with a woman who believes him to be the Messiah, but now has a fuller understanding that there are no limits to what that means. That even the tomb, even the grave, even the stone, even dead 4 days, that none of that can keep Jesus from calling and bringing life. And, that turns into sermon very quickly, but I think that's part of what John is doing here. I think he's preaching to us.
And don't miss not just the image of what's going to happen to Jesus, but the one who's going to do it. Because for a moment, recognize Jesus is the one who calls out to Lazarus, come out. When Jesus himself experiences death, the question is going to be, if Jesus is dead, who raises the dead? Who raises the dead to life if he's not there? Well, make it very clear, Father, I thank you for having heard me. John has, in a very subtle and powerful way, already set up in this story, the story resurrection of Lazarus, that it is God the Father who also is the one operating with this power of resurrection. So, Clint, there's already some question answering happening. Well, what's going to happen when Jesus dies? Who raises Jesus if Jesus isn't there to do the raising? Well, in this story itself is embedded the Father, the one who has the power over life itself. And John is laying that foundational bedrock so that we might understand, number one, that Jesus is doing resurrection power while he's alive, and that the power that gives him the power to do so exists beyond him, because it's the Father who will do that work. So there's some really subtle, amazing theological work being pinned out here in this story, if you're willing and able to see it.
Yeah, and I think if you are aware of that, it's not surprising that John takes an entire chapter. He devotes an entire chapter. In fact, there's more coming to tell us this story. This is it's kind of midpoint. It's a little bit of a transition in regard to the story itself, because we're about to move to Jerusalem. But this is an important moment, and I think John has carefully shared it with us.
It's a beautiful story.
Stuff.
Yeah, grateful to have you with us. Give this video a like if it's been interesting, engaging for you. Certainly subscribe so you don't miss the story that continues on beyond this point. But it's been a joy to have you with us today, and we will see you next week.